Greetings, Kerbonauts. This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and this is a real solar system launch of the Juno rocket going to Jupiter. In this episode, you are going to get an excruciatingly detailed look at what went into making this, as well as what the real one is like. And I'll tell you what, this is the most detailed rocket and satellite that I have ever done. Wait until you see what I did to make this thing. But first, let's see the launch.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition and liftoff of the Atlas V with Juno on a trek to Jupiter, a planetary piece of the puzzle on the beginning of our solar system.
Picture roll program is in progress. Vehicle pod rates look good. Booster PU has gone to its SRB chamber pressures have plateaued. I'm rolling on. Signatures look good. RD-180 operation. That's on this point. Mach 1. SRB chambers continue to roll off. Max Q. Boosters throttling up. We're on schedule. Engine response looks good. Booster V's gone to closed loop control. Came for our SRB throttle down momentarily. Engine continues to operate well. Throttle back. Looking for SRB burnout soon. Chamber pressures have plateaued on the SRBs. And we're beginning to roll off. And BOTA has been satisfied. Vehicle is starting back up to full thrust. And we have solids 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 jettisoned. Visual indication that all solids have separated well. And the booster has begun its roll for spacecraft thermal constraints. Rates look good. Bus and battery voltages are stable. And the vehicle has now gone into closed loop steering. And booster PU is also on closed loop control. Engine response looks good for the set mixed ratio. Current altitude is 45.8 miles in altitude. Downrange distance 69 miles. Coming up on our RCS pyro valve activation. It is now fired. System's now pressurizing to flight levels. We've begun our 2.5 G throttle segment. Engine response looks good. Current altitude is 60 miles in altitude, downrange distance 69 miles, velocity 5,413 miles per hour. Coming up on our next mark event will be payload fairing jettison, followed by the CFR jettison. And we have payload fairing jettison and CFR jettison. Boosters throttled back up to full thrust. Engine response looks good. Downrange distance 118 miles. Velocity is 6,983 miles per hour. Pogo pyro vent has been fired. Now accelerating at 4.7 Gs as we work our way to our 5G throttle segment. Boost phase cool down is underway. Now throttling to maintain 5 Gs. And begun throttling to 4.6 Gs in preparation for BECO. Boost phase cool down is complete. We have BECO. Engine shutdown looks good. We have retros and stage separation. We have LOX and fuel pre-start. RCS-GN2 purge firing is underway. We have ignition and full thrust on the RL-10. Centaur closed loop steering has been enabled. Small body rates associated with closed loop steering. Vehicle tank pressures are being ramped down as expected. Centaur PU has been commanded to oxidizer-rich fixed angles for the early part of this 6-minute and 2-second burn. Current altitude is 112 miles. Downrange distance is 589 miles. Velocity is 14,318 miles per hour. Range track shows the vehicle right down the middle of the corridor, making excellent progress.
And there we go. We're up there pretty high now. We're just circularizing our orbit. So I'm going to begin talking about Juno just a bit. Juno was part of NASA's New Frontiers program. It was a mission to Jupiter that was launched from Cape Canaveral in August of 2011. It was expected to arrive in July of 2016. So as of the making of this video, they still haven't gotten there. Well, you heard the announcer earlier saying that this was going to be over 6 minutes for a burn to put us in our low orbit, so we're going to go into the VAB and begin disassembling this and seeing all the cool details that went into making it. But before I could do that, I needed to know what to make, and that meant research. So I went to the internet and I downloaded every image I could find about an Atlas V or a Juno, the launch itself, to figure out how I was going to put this thing together. I wanted to make it as accurate as possible on all of the parts, as well as the launch masses and the volumes of the tanks and the fuel that was used and where the boosters were placed and everything. This image right here ultimately was the best one I could find in terms of giving me details about the Atlas 551. Now we'll actually go into the VAB and start by moving away these launch clamps to make it a little bit easier to see, and then we can take a look at the lower stage that has the 5 boosters. You can see right there, 3 on one side, 2 on the other. At the bottom here we have our core booster engine and the core booster running up through the middle, but I'm going to cover that second. We're going to do this in bits. We'll begin with the first thing that we saw decouple and we'll work our way to the top. The first thing we saw decouple was these boosters, and so we'll begin there. For some reason, it was very difficult to find information about those boosters, except this one page showed a booster in the upper right. From here, I was able to get the dimensions, the mass values, and the thrust value, and take that back into KSP, where I could start replicating that as a part, where I started with a KW rocketry part, and then just tweaked it until it looked and performed correctly. Using those dimensions and a guess at how many liters I was supposed to have in there, I put this, you can see 21,047 liters of HTPB, which is the solid fuel that I think was used in that. And that brought it up to a mass of 40 tons, well, almost 41 tons of solid fuel. When you add that with the dry mass, it comes out to 45.7 roughly. Now, if you look at that solid rocket booster description, you see that it's a little more than 46. Well, I moved some of the mass into the decoupler, and so together the decoupler and the solid booster are coming out close to about that amount. The other thing to note is the ISP is set to 275 in the description, but I think that thrust value of 1361 might be the sea level thrust value, and so I had to set my thrust value to 1686 for its peak amount, so that it would come out correctly once it had gotten to the 275, but also because of the starting at the 245 like I have it here, and with the cut pattern on the inside of the booster, it ended up generating at liftoff about the 1361 kilonewtons that it's supposed to be generating. And when I say cut pattern, what I'm talking about is this. Real SRBs have a pattern on the inside that determines how much thrust they're going to have at different points in their flight. I used Engine Thrust Controller, the mod, in order to control the SRB thrust levels as it went. So at liftoff, over here on the right is how much thrust we had, and as we move left, that's as we go higher in altitude. And we see that we go through, when we're going through max Q, it drops way down, but then it goes back up again after you're through max Q, and then it comes down again as the thrust to weight is going up because the mass is going down as the fuel is being burned. So let's see how we're doing out here. Okay, so the Centaur is still very low in its periapsis. We're still circularizing. And I could jump ahead in this launch, but one of the things I've said before about real solar system is the whole point of it is to be more realistic. And that means things should take a little bit longer than they normally would. So I'm not going to jump too far ahead, but on the other hand, it isn't entirely fascinating to sit here staring at this. So we will break this up a little bit by looking at the beginning of the construction of the Juno here, and what it was like when I had absolutely no parts whatsoever and I was just beginning to put them on. It all begins here at the launch pad, where I throw together a few parts that I'm interested in using, but I don't really do much to make them like a real rocket. This is just a test. We fire it up to see how it's going to fly, and obviously it's not supposed to do very well, and it performs exactly like it's expected. It doesn't do very well at all, but it allows me to see a few things that need to change. And I had done a little bit of setup on them, and then I reverted and went back to the launch pad, and what is going on here? There's gaps all throughout the rocket. Well, it turned out there was a strange bug that you couldn't have models with different sized rescaled parts. When you revert, it would go back to these weird sizes, and so I needed to start all over again and completely redo all those parts. It had taken a few hours to get that set up the first time. The second time we're going through here, I only put on half the fairing so that I could look at it on the inside and see if it was wiggling, swaying around, or anything like that. And I can see there's a little bit of a jiggle right there, a little jiggle, 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 yeah. Well, we're going to fix that when it comes time to do the real launch, but I thought it was doing fairly well up until then. The disassembly was totally expected, and honestly, at the beginning of these rocket launches, when I'm setting everything up, I want to see it blowing up. I want to see it go from exploding to success. You saw that I had a little bit of payload in there, and it's making its way to the ground right now. All that is a few panels at this point. It's not even close to the proper payload. All right, well, that's how it starts out, and we can look out here and see that we're still making our way up. So let's go take a look at the next stage. So we're back in the VAB, and did I mention last time how I had these two decouplers right here that are actually welded together into one part? Well, if I didn't, I did now. I bring that up because there's a lot of welding that went on into making this whole rocket. We can begin at the bottom. If we ignore all the boosters that we already got off of the side there from the last time I was in here, at the bottom of the rocket you can see that I have the engines covered up with this heat shield that I made myself. Basically, it's two parts, a regular KSP end cap in there that's been stuck onto the end of this little orange and white interstage, which ended up looking like a heat shield. Or I mean like the heat shield that is used on the bottom of the Atlas. But under there, protected, hidden away, is the engine itself, which I'm using the exact same model that would be on an Atlas. That's the RD-180 model. It's the same type of engine that is used on the Atlas. Along the side of it, I ran a fuel pipe. Now that is actually welded into this fuel tank. It isn't a separate thing that I put on the side there with any kind of parts that I attach together. Those are actually built into the model now because I took these turns. See this? This is what it really looks like right here. Well, I can't even surface attach it. Maybe I can, no, I can't surface attach it anywhere. Here, how about if we do, well, that still doesn't work, but you get the idea. It's a very large pipe, and I took another pipe that normally would be about that big, but I scaled it all the way down the whole side to represent that there was fuel flowing from an upper tank up here down through that pipe and into the engine area. We can also see that along the side I have a bunch of retro boosters, just like on the real Atlas. Now they don't have this on the Atlas. These are lights. They're from the Surface Lights mod, and you just have to have lights on anything to make it look really cool, right? So we have more lights. Scrolling our way up to the top here, you can see that that is a KW rocketry fuel tank, and that is the end of that. Now, if we want to start working our way into what the fairing was like and what's in here, which you can see just a little bit of it right there. There's the bottom of the Centaur engine and the bottom of the Centaur itself. Sitting right inside that fairing, we'll probably want to begin looking at this from the top. I took a KW rocketry clamshell and I just scaled it until it was the exact height that the real Atlas payload fairing was in the real launch. We have one on that side and one on that side. Also in here, we have this thing called the Centaur Forward Load Reactor, or CFLR. Now the way that works is you saw the fairing on there a moment ago. I'm going to pull the fairing back up so I can show you one more time. So right there, there's these little markers, little panels or something, whatever you want to call them, right here and right there that I have used as ways to put attachments so that I can put a strut that goes in between that panel and the fairing. Notice the fairing right there also has a little panel attached to it. That's welded into the fairing now. That provides some extra structural integrity that helps hold that whole thing together. This is attached via a customized decoupler right here. So when we're launching and this decouples, it pops out like this and then floats away right after, of course, the fairing itself has been taken away. So we'll pop that off there. So the fairing would already be gone, and then that forward load reactor would pop off sideways as well and fly down past the sides of the rocket as we go, leaving us just with our Centaur and our payload here. I use Simple Part Organizer to put all of my parts into different folders. And in this case, I created 3 special folders for the parts Juno, Centaur, and Atlas. That way it'd be easy for me to keep track of everything I had made. We're going to begin by selecting just the Atlas parts. And from there we'll begin by just putting out a fuel tank. Now if you look in the bottom corner of the screen, you're going to see in the inset picture here, shows you exactly what this is supposed to look like. Well, I created these special parts to act just like the ones that you see in that picture. We start off here with our Common Core Booster Circular Interstage Adapter, and you'll also notice that these mass values match exactly what they're supposed to match in order to be just like the parts that are from this description. So with that one goes on first right there, then the next part up is this Centaur Interstage Adapter. That one has their actual logo on it. We'll put that one right there. Next, the part that goes down inset into the center here is this Canonical Interstage Adapter, and that one goes down in there and sits like that. And finally, they have the Aft Stub Adapter, which goes on right here. Around the whole thing is the Boat Tail Adapter that goes on top like that, and now we have the seating area where the Centaur's engine and lower part of the fuel tank sits and links in right here to be nice and stable. We'll flip over here and refilter to bring in the Centaur parts. This engine, the RL10, would go down there like that. Inside here, now this isn't actually how I built it, so the nodes don't work quite right when you go from the bottom up. I'd have to go from the top down. I'll do that in just a moment. But you can see that how the engine would normally fit down seated inside here, just above that lower tank, inside this section right here, sort of like that. I'll show it from the side. The Centaur fuel tank is made up of 2 different parts. There's this one here, which again, you can see that I've welded some bits together. Pipes from the SXT mod and some other orange tanks that I got out of another one as like a space shuttle mod. And then some panels down here at the bottom, which you'll see in a moment. Those are used for the RCS jets to be able to attach to something nice and flat. Above those goes the other section. This is the liquid hydrogen tank. Below that is the liquid oxygen tank. Notice that it has in it only the liquid oxygen here, and this one has only the H2. The oxygen tank is at the bottom because it's so much smaller. That way the fuel line doesn't have to run as far, and the fuel line runs on the outside to bring that fuel down toward the engine. So if we had started the other way around, where I had this fuel tank here instead, and then we attach them bit by bit to build from the Centaur down, you can see that we put our first fuel tank there, then the second one, the engine goes on the bottom there, then we can work our way into the adapter pieces that I just showed a moment ago. Now they're going to fit a whole lot better because this is the same direction that I built it in the first place. So that adapter goes there, which gives you a nice connection point to connect it to the canonical interstage adapter, just like that. Under there, we put the interstage adapter right on that connector, which gives us now a location where we can put our boat tail. And finally, the circular interstage adapter that goes to the core booster goes at the very bottom. And there we go. Now going back into the Centaur parts one more time, you can see that I also have the payload adapter. This is a very welded part. There is a fuel tank section there that I welded together with a near future propulsion construction piece on the top. The bottom was a fuel tank from LLL. Then I have these sort of like beams or panels that came out of LLL, but I scaled them to make them nice and fat, which gave me some locations that I could then place all of the command parts. I have avionics, which just provides the command control. Then I have a special one here that's my mech jeb core, and then I have another one that provides the SAS, and I have to put one of each of these on in different locations around the outside. I won't line them up right now. And those go around the outside like that to provide all of the flight controls. Probably have one more like over there so that there's a space in between them. And then if we switch over here, you can see one of the things I also put on there is an antenna. That's my antenna. And I also put batteries. A Centaur, based on how far it needs to go, whether it's going up to geosynchronous orbit or if it just has to go into a low orbit for a short time, it determines the number of batteries that they load on there. Also determined by where they're going is the number of helium tanks that they're going to put down in this lower section as well, and how many hydrazine tanks they might have. I constructed some very special little RCS controls here by taking, once again, some panels of some kind. I think it might have been a weight. And then I crafted what I believe might be the right ones, MRM 106D with 4 nozzles, and then this one with only 2 nozzles. And what they do is they put them on like this, and we'll shift that around there, see that? And then they symmetry it, one that has 4 nozzles on one side, and then this one would have 2 nozzles there. And I had to really work on those to get those pointed in just the right direction too. And then those little panels, now you can see what they're for. Normally when I'm putting these things on, they don't want to stay still. See how they're kind of shifting around? That panel gave me a nice flat section that I could put this on. And finally, the helium tanks are right here. These are the Centaur helium bottles. They are nothing but cosmetic. They serve no purpose. I just put them on here to represent that those would be on the real launch. And of course, then there's these hydrazine bottles as well that would go down here. Moving our way up toward the top, as long as I have the right part selected, and I do, there's the forward load adapter. Now you can see how that goes on here. It goes right to that connection node, which is a node that I put into that adapter, that Centaur payload adapter right there. I put that in, I welded it together using a semicircular part, and then I put that semicircular part in over and over. You can see them here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of those, shrunk down so that they were nice and thin, and then scaled to different distances so that they'd create different arcs from the inside out, making it look like it was one solid piece. And on top of all of this, I have the actual Juno payload adapter that would go right there, and then Juno sits on here. In fact, I'll pull out one bit of it right here. The first bit, this is their Lyros 1B engine, and that would sit right there underneath this lower hexagonal panel that would be the very base of the Juno rocket itself. Now this engine is kind of interesting. If you look at it real close, you can see very ghostly in there an image of an engine. Obviously, it looks like it's a docking port. Well, that's because it is. I took a docking port, the shrouded docking port, and I embedded an engine directly into that part. So you can see right here, it has Lyros 1B, looks like a docking port, has a little engine, max thrust, 0.707. Now, technically, that's a little bit above where it's going to operate. It's going to operate a little lower than its actual maximum. And I'll simulate that simply by keeping the throttle a little bit lower than the cap 2. I'll put it up to like 90, 85, 90% rather than 100% throttle when I'm doing my maneuver. Okay, we're going to come back to the Juno here in just a bit. Let's go check on how we're doing. Looks like we're doing pretty good. We're about to shut off. There we go. We've shut off the engines. I think it's time for a little bit more of how it's made. This is what it looked like when I was trying to perfect the RCS jets for the Centaur. I had welded 4 different little nozzles there together into one part, and then came out here to look at it, and this is where it begins. So you can see it took a lot of fiddling to get that all welded together. Also, for the longest time, the actual jets themselves didn't want to work. I kept fiddling with them over and over again, seeing why weren't they actually producing any thrust. That problem turned out to be an incompatibility with a mod, an RCS thrust mod. Once that was taken care of, you can see that it was time to go out and test the fairing. I don't think I had any struts going between the fairing and the load reactor yet, so it was very wiggly and spun itself to bits once it had essentially failed and started back toward the ground. That's okay, it wasn't really going anywhere this time anyway. And who doesn't like a good explosion? I hope you do, because there's a few more in my future for this video before we finally get to seeing Juno going over to Jupiter. Here's another one where I don't really have a payload in there yet. I have some mass in order to try and simulate a payload, just a few of the parts. It's not completely set up yet. We're just experimenting with multiple things at the same time. And one of them is this Centaur load reactor apparently works as a really great parachute. And to do our part for the environment, we're going to take this piece back inside, slap it on the next rocket, and reuse it. So here we go again. The testing continues, and on this one we can see that the gimbaling on that engine in combination with the payload being unstable is causing the whole thing to just gyrate like a bucking bronco. After being adequately amused by this, I then reverted and decided to work on something new. I started to build the actual Juno craft itself, and the first thing I wanted to do with that was create some customized solar panels that would open up exactly the same way that the real Juno solar panels did. That's being done by using some Infernal Robotics hinges in between some plates, and right now those plates do not act as solar panels, but once I get done with them, they will. I will just embed some existing solar panels on there, some of the flat kind, and then they will function to bring in all that luscious solar juice. So my first test there showed that I didn't have the right step value on the Infernal Robotics servo. One panel was moving a little bit slower than the other ones needed to, and so the panels ended up pointing straight in the air, but after a little change, now the panels open up sideways the way they're supposed to, and I can work on testing a few other things, like rotating out one of the science instruments. And after that, we'll just hack the gravity so that there really isn't any gravity, and turn on the engine to give it a little flying test as well. I just want to see if the effects look okay, and whether or not there's any meaningful thrust with that engine embedded inside the docking node the way that I've hacked it together there. But it looks like it's working okay. Now, while we watch the rest of the testing process in the background here, where we see some of the decoupling tests and various other hacked flights, just to get a feel for whether everything was going to work correctly before we were really putting it to the test for real launches, I will let you in on a little secret. This mission was done for me a year before this video. So you're probably wondering, what could possibly have gone on in all that time? Why has it taken a year to get this thing together? Well, what happened is I spent probably a good 100 hours working on this. I called this my ship in a bottle exercise. I made every single detail on that thing as accurate as I possibly could, and you're going to get to see exactly what I mean a little bit later. But after I had spent that 100 or so hours on it, I didn't want to work on the video right away. I gave it a little bit of a break, so a couple weeks after that I started working on it. Unfortunately, after many hours of editing that video, something happened to the files, and they became corrupted, so I was going to need to start over again. So once again, rather than starting over a little bit demoralized, I simply put it away and said I'll come back to this later. And then more time goes by. Eventually I did come back to it, and I was trying to work on editing things, and I came to the realization that there was just a lot of footage, and I didn't know how I was going to make it fit into a decently small episode. So after getting about 25 minutes of the video put down in the editor, I then set it aside again, trying to think, how am I going to trim this down and yet include all of the content? Well, it stayed like that for a long time, and I started thinking, I know what I'll do. I'll just put this into an episode for Project Alexandria when it comes time for it. Unfortunately, I also knew that that was going to be years into the future, so who knows how long it was going to be before this Juno video would actually see the light of day if I did it that way. So more time went by, and fast forward again until recently, when I've started working on episode 46 of Project Odyssey. With that one taking as long as it is, it seemed like it was the perfect time to go back and resurrect my Juno mission video. And so here we are, and better yet, I know what I want to do now. I want to cover everything there was, so I'm just going to split it up into a couple episodes. So this is sort of like another mini-series. We had our Operation Gold Strike mini-series, and now we'll have the Juno Mission mini-series. This will probably only be 2 or 3 episodes, probably 2, but we'll see. Anyway, since I'm going to break it up, I think we're going to end it here. But before we go, I want to give you a little glimpse into some of the things you're going to get to see next time. Perhaps some more explosions, a deeper look inside Juno, and of course Jupiter. Until next time, I will see you later, Curvinauts.